In the autumn of 1879, while every experienced settler in the Sierra Nevada mountains was building low, sturdy cabins designed to hunker down against the brutal winter winds, two orphan girls were doing something that made the entire town of Pine Ridge think they had lost their minds. Astrid Solvang was 19 years old. Her sister Ingrid was 14. They had no parents, no money, no experience building anything larger than a chicken coop. And yet there they stood, in the shadow of the most unforgiving mountain range in California, measuring out the foundation for a structure that would become the most ridiculed building project the territory had ever seen. They were building a house with a door on the second floor, not a window, a door, 10 feet above the ground, with hinges and a handle and a threshold, and as if someone might actually walk through it into thin air. The locals called it the lighthouse for a sea that did not exist. They called it the Orphan Folly. They called it a grave built above ground. 6 months later, those same locals would be climbing through that impossible door, tears frozen on their faces, begging to be let inside. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how two teenage girls with nothing but a worn leather journal and a loyal dog came to save an entire community, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the letter that changed everything, back to the day Astrid Solvang learned that her dead father had left her something more valuable than gold. The letter arrived at St. Catherine's Home for Orphan Children in Sacramento on a Tuesday morning in September. Sister Agnes brought it to Astrid during breakfast, her wrinkled face puzzled by the official seal pressed into the wax. Astrid had been at the orphanage for 3 years. 3 years of scrubbing floors and mending clothes and watching younger children get adopted while she grew too old, too tall, too serious for any family to want. Her sister Ingrid sat beside her, 14 years old, and already wearing the same guarded expression that kept potential parents at a distance. They had learned not to hope. Hope was a luxury orphans could not afford. But the letter in Astrid's hands was about to change everything. It was from a lawyer in a town called Pine Ridge, nestled high in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The letter informed her that her father, Eric Solvang, had filed a land claim before his death. 40 acres of wilderness in the highest part of the valley. The claim had been held in trust, waiting for his eldest daughter to come of age. Astrid read the letter 3 times before she understood what it meant. They had land. They had a future. They had a way out. What the letter did not mention was the wooden box that came with it, a box containing a worn leather journal filled with her father's handwriting, diagrams and measurements and notes passed down through 4 generations of Solvangs, all the way back to the frozen mountain.
Girl, that is not a house you are building. That is your own grave.
And you are building it before you are even dead.
You will see.
Mountains of Norway. And tucked into the back of the journal, a single photograph. Her father standing next to a strange 2-story cabin with a door impossibly high on the upper level. Behind him, snow piled higher than the roofline of the neighboring houses. On the back of the photograph, her father had written 5 words in his careful script. When the snow comes, remember. They arrived in Pine Ridge on the first day of October, carrying everything they owned in 2 canvas bags. The stagecoach driver had warned them about the town, small, isolated, full of miners and ranchers who did not take kindly to outsiders. What he did not warn them about was the dog. He was waiting at the edge of town, a large shepherd mix with intelligent eyes and a greying muzzle. The moment Astrid stepped down from the stagecoach, he rose from where he had been lying in the dust and walked directly to her. He pressed his head against her hand and looked up at her with an expression that could only be described as recognition. A man emerged from the general store, wiping his hands on his apron. "That dog belonged to Eric Solvang," he said. "I've been waiting here for 3 years, ever since the mine collapse. Figured he was waiting for something. Guess he was waiting for you. The dog's name was Odin. He was 5 years old now, born in the spring of 1874, just 2 years before the mine had claimed Erik Solvang's life. He had been her father's constant companion, his guardian through countless winters in this unforgiving land. Now he would be theirs. Astrid knelt down and looked into Odin's eyes. She saw loyalty there, patience, and something else. Something that looked almost like a warning. Winter is coming, those eyes seemed to say. And you are not ready. The land was exactly as the lawyer had described. 40 acres on the highest ridge of the valley, exposed to every wind that blew down from the mountains. The existing cabin was little more than a shack, and built hastily by her father before the mine claimed his life. It would not survive a serious winter. Astrid stood on the ridge and looked out over the valley below. She could see the other homesteads scattered across the lower slopes. Solid cabins with thick walls and low roofs built by people who had lived here for decades. They knew this land. They knew its dangers. She was a 19-year-old orphan with a leather journal and a borrowed hammer. But she was also the granddaughter of Magnus Solvang, who had survived the White Death of 1849 in Norway, the great blizzard that buried entire villages under 30 feet of snow, the storm that killed 47 people in a single valley. Only one family had survived that night, the Solvangs. And they had survived because Magnus had built his cabin differently. Higher, stranger, but with a door on the second floor that everyone had mocked, until the snow came. Astrid opened her father's journal and began to read. The design was unlike anything the people of Pine Ridge had ever seen. Instead of a low, single-story structure designed to present a minimal profile to the wind, Astrid began laying out the foundation for a building that would stand 24 feet tall. 2 full stories, with the second floor accessible not only from inside, but from an external door set 10 feet above the ground level. The walls would be 12 inches thick, with a gap between the inner and outer layers filled with dried moss and grass for insulation. The fireplace would be massive, built from local granite rising through both floors and extending 8 feet above the roofline to provide...
Fire is unforgiving. One mistake, and the blade is ruined. Pay attention to the curve here.
...prevent snow from blocking the chimney and the roof. The roof would be pitched at 60 degrees, steep enough that no amount of snow could accumulate. It would simply slide off, building up around the base of the house instead of crushing it from above. But the most important feature was the second floor door. Her grandfather's journal explained it clearly. In Norway, during the worst winters, snow could pile 15 or 20 feet deep in a single week. Houses built in the traditional way became tombs. The snow would block the doors and windows, cut off the chimneys, suffocate the fires. Families would slowly freeze or choke to death in their own homes, buried alive beneath the white silence. The second floor door was the solution. When the snow reached the first floor, you simply moved your living space upward. The door became your exit to the surface of the snow, or your connection to the outside world, your path to survival. In Norway, they called this design a two-life house. One life for summer, one life for winter. Astrid would build both. The first skeptic arrived on October 3rd. Ezekiel Whitmore was 55 years old, the most successful rancher in the valley, and the kind of man who believed his 30 years of experience gave him the right to judge everyone else's decisions. He rode up on a grey mare, his weathered face twisted into an expression that hovered somewhere between amusement and pity. "Girl," he said, stepping down from his horse and walking slowly around the foundation markers Astrid had laid out. "I have lived in these mountains for 3 decades. I have seen blizzards that would turn your blood to ice, and in all that time I have never seen anyone build a house like this. Astrid did not stop working. She continued measuring, marking, preparing. That second door, Whitmore continued, gesturing toward the upper level she had sketched in the dirt. 10 feet off the ground. What do you plan to do? Teach yourself to fly. It is for when the snow is higher than the first floor, Astrid said quietly, not looking up. Whitmore laughed, a genuine, belly-deep laugh that echoed across the ridge. Higher than the first floor. He shook his head. Girl, the snow here gets deep, I will grant you that. But 10 feet? That is not a house you are building. That is your own grave, and you are building it before you are even dead. He mounted his horse and looked down at her with something that might have been genuine concern buried beneath the condescension. I will give you one piece of advice for free. Stop this foolishness. Build a proper cabin like everyone else. Or, better yet, sell this land to someone who knows what they are doing and go back to wherever you came from. Astrid finally looked up. Her blue eyes met his, calm and steady. You will see, she said. 3 words. That was all. Whitmore rode away, shaking his head, already composing the story he would tell at the saloon that evening. The story of the crazy orphan girl building a lighthouse on the mountain. He did not know that those 3 words would haunt him for the rest of his life. What would you have done in Astrid's place? A teenage orphan with no experience, being laughed at by a man with 30 years of knowledge. Would you have listened to him? Would you have given up? Or would you have kept building, trusting in the wisdom passed down from your grandfather? And tell me your thoughts in the comments below. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Astrid's life. Every day began before sunrise. She and Ingrid would eat a cold breakfast of hard bread and dried meat, then walk into the forest to select trees. Douglas fir, her father's journal specified, 18 inches in diameter for the main posts, 12 inches for the secondary supports. The wood had to be straight, had to be strong, had to be cut at precisely the right angle to bear the weight of a structure designed to hold 20 people. Astrid had never felled a tree in her life. The first one took her 4 hours and nearly killed her when it fell in the wrong direction. By the end of the month, she could bring down a suitable tree in 40 minutes. Her hands blistered. The blisters broke and bled. New calluses formed over the raw skin, thick and hard. Her shoulders ached from swinging the axe. Her back screamed from dragging logs. Her fingers grew numb from working in the cold morning air. Ingrid worked beside her, never complaining, though she was 4 years younger and half her sister's size. She learned to strip bark, to notch logs, to mix the mud and grass that would fill the gaps in the walls. She learned to read their father's journal, to translate the technical drawings into practical instructions. And Odin was always there, watching, waiting, occasionally pulling small...
How could you do this? After everything we've been through, you just sit there and cry while they sleep.
loads of branches when they attached ropes to his harness. He seemed to understand what they were building, seemed to approve of it in some canine way that went beyond instinct. At night, Astrid would sit by the fire in their temporary shack, studying her father's journal by candlelight. The pages were filled with numbers and diagrams, but also with stories. Her grandfather's voice echoing through her father's handwriting, explaining not just how to build, but why. Still air is the best insulator God ever made, one passage read. 8 inches of trapped air equals 4 inches of solid wood. Build your walls with a gap between the layers and the cold cannot reach you. Another passage described the chimney design. The flue must extend high above the roofline, or snow will block it and your fire becomes your death. 8 feet minimum, 10 feet if you can manage it. and again the emphasis on the second-floor door. When the snow rises higher than your door, your house becomes your coffin. Always build a way out, always build upward. The second skeptic arrived in the middle of October. Robert Mansfield was the town carpenter, a man of 48 years who had built most of the cabins in Pine Ridge. He considered himself an expert. He considered himself indispensable. He considered himself far too important to be ignored by a teenage girl who clearly knew nothing about construction. He walked slowly around the partially completed frame, his experienced eyes cataloguing every joint, every beam, every angle. His expression grew darker with each passing minute. "This is structurally unsound," he announced finally, loud enough for his two assistants to hear. "The second floor will never hold weight. You have used too few cross braces. The roof pitch is far too steep. And this." He pointed at the space where the second floor door would be installed. "This is not architecture. This is insanity." Astrid was on the roof frame, securing a beam into place. She looked down at him calmly. "The floor uses 8 diagonal braces instead of 4 straight ones," she said. "It distributes weight more efficiently. My grandfather designed it to hold 50 people during a storm." Mansfield scoffed. "Your grandfather? A Norwegian peasant who never saw a proper building in his life." He shook his head. "I have been building in this territory for 25 years. I have never used diagonal bracing because it is unnecessary. It is a waste of wood." "Perhaps," Astrid said, returning to her work, "but his houses are still standing after 100 years. How old is the oldest house you have built?" Mansfield's face reddened. His assistants exchanged uncomfortable glances. "You will regret this," the carpenter said, his voice tight with anger. When this monstrosity collapses in the first real wind, do not come crying to me for help." He turned and walked away, already planning what he would say to the other townspeople, already composing the warnings he would issue about the dangerous structure being built by the ignorant orphan girls. By November, Astrid had become the most talked-about person in Pine Ridge, not in a good way. Margaret Holloway, the wife of the general store owner, had made it her personal mission to spread concern about the Solvang sisters. She stood at her counter each day, shaking her head sadly at every customer who came in. "Those poor girls," she would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "No parents, no guidance. No one to tell them they are making a terrible mistake. I heard they have been living on nothing but beans and bread for weeks. And that structure they are building," she would lean in conspiratorially. "Robert Mansfield says it will collapse before Christmas. Such a tragedy waiting to happen." The gossip spread like water through cracks, seeping into every conversation, every gathering, every moment of idle chatter in the saloon or the church or the general store. Father Brennan, the town priest, came to visit on the first Sunday of November. He was a man of 60 years, well-meaning but deeply suspicious of anything that smelled of foreign wisdom. "My children," he said, standing at the edge of their property and refusing to come closer, as if the half-built structure might be contagious. "I am concerned about the source of these building techniques. Norway, I am told, the land of the Vikings, pagans who worshipped false gods." Astrid paused her work and looked at him. "The Vikings became Christians 1,000 years ago, Father. My family has been Catholic for generations." Father Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "Still, these methods, they are not how God-fearing people build their homes." "With respect, Father," Astrid said, "God also created the snow, and the snow here will be higher than a man's head. My grandfather's methods are designed to survive that snow. Is survival not God's will?" The priest had no answer for that. He left, but the seed of suspicion he had planted continued to grow. The cruelest mockery came from the young men of the town. Colt Tanner was 22, handsome in a rough way, and completely convinced of his own wit and charm. He gathered his friends outside the saloon one evening and proposed a wager. $10, he announced, loud enough for half the street to hear. $10 says that house falls down before the first snow. $20? Another voice called out. 20 says those orphan girls run back to Sacramento before Thanksgiving. The bets multiplied. $50? $100? Someone offered to bet their horse that the structure would not survive to see the new year.
I thought I knew everything. I was wrong. We were all wrong.
Get up, Mr. Whitmore. We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Samuel Creek, the saloon owner, kept a ledger of all the wagers. He was a businessman first and foremost, and he saw no reason why the misfortune of 2 orphan girls could not become a source of entertainment and profit for the rest of the town. Word of the betting pool reached Astrid within a day. Ingrid came back from the general store with tears in her eyes, having overheard 2 women laughing about the odds against them. Astrid put down her tools and took her sister's hands. "Let them laugh," she said quietly. "It's let them bet their money. When winter comes, we will still be here. And they will understand. But what if they are right?" Ingrid whispered. "What if it does fall down?" Astrid looked up at the structure rising against the autumn sky. It was almost complete now. The walls were solid. The roof was taking shape. The second-floor door frame stood ready for its hinges. "Our grandfather survived the White Death of 1849, she said. 47 people died in his valley. Only his family lived, and they lived because of this design." She squeezed her sister's hands. "We are Solvangs. We do not build graves, we build shelters. And this shelter will save not just us, but everyone who comes to it when the snow falls. Not everyone in Pine Ridge was cruel." Martha Briggs arrived on a cold morning in the second week of November, carrying a basket of fresh bread and a jar of preserves. She was 72 years old, a widow who had outlived 2 husbands and 4 of her 6 children. Her face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She stood for a long time, looking at the nearly completed structure. Then she began to nod, slowly, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "My father spoke of houses like this," she said finally. "Back in Scotland, in the Highlands where the snow came down like God's own fury. He called them 2 life houses. 1 life for the warm months. 1 life for when the White Death comes." Astrid nearly dropped the hammer she was holding. "You have heard of this design?" Martha smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "The old ways, child. They are old because they work." She gestured at the second-floor door. That door up there. My father had one just like it. He said it saved his family 3 times before they came to America." She handed the basket to Ingrid. "You keep building, girls. Do not listen to the fools in town. They have lived here 30 years and think they know everything. They do not know that the mountains remember longer than men." She became their first true ally. She visited twice a week, bringing food and encouragement. She told them stories of her father's homeland, of winters so fierce that entire villages disappeared under the snow. She validated what Astrid already knew in her heart. The old ways survived because they worked, and they would work again. The second ally came unexpectedly. Klaus Weber was the town blacksmith, a German immigrant who had settled in Pine Ridge 20 years ago. He was a quiet man, rarely seen outside his forge, known for quality work and minimal conversation. He appeared at the building site one afternoon, watching silently as Astrid struggled to secure a heavy beam. "That joint," he said finally, his German accent still thick after 2 decades. "It is the Bavarian style. My uncle built like this in the mountains." Everyone laughed at him. Astrid paused. "What happened to your uncle?" "The avalanche of 54. He was the only one whose house survived." Klaus's eyes were distant, seeing something far away and long ago. 23 people lived because they could reach his door. He walked closer, examining the structure with professional eyes. "Your hinges. They are not strong enough for the second-floor door. Snow will push against that door with the weight of 100 men. You need hinges that can bear that weight." Astrid felt her heart sink. She had already spent almost everything they had on wood and supplies. Special hinges were beyond her means. Klaus seemed to read her thoughts. "I will make them," he said. He pulled a piece of charcoal from his pocket and began sketching on a spare plank. 4 hinges, reinforced brackets, a locking mechanism that cannot freeze shut. He looked up at her. "No charge." "Why?" Astrid asked. "Because my uncle saved my family," Klaus said simply. "And because the people who laugh at you now are the same kind of people who laughed at him." He tucked the charcoal away. "I will have them ready in 1 week." The third person who did not laugh came as a complete surprise. Verity Whitmore was 16 years old, the only daughter of Ezekiel Whitmore, the man who had called Astrid's cabin a grave. She appeared at the building site one afternoon in late October, alone, her horse tied to a tree at the edge of the property. She did not announce herself. She simply sat on a fallen log and watched. Astrid noticed her after an hour but said nothing. She continued working, securing beams, checking measurements, consulting her father's journal. Finally, as the sun began to set, Verity spoke. "My father says you are building something impossible." Her voice was quiet, curious, without the mockery that colored her father's words. "But I have been watching you for 3 weeks, from the ridge above our ranch. I can see this place from my bedroom window." Astrid paused her work. "You work from before sunrise until after dark," Verity continued. "You never stop, you never complain, and the building keeps getting taller." She tilted her head. "I studying the structure. It does not look impossible to me. It looks like someone who knows exactly what she is doing." "Your father would not approve of you being here," Astrid said carefully. "My father does not approve of many things. But he is not always right." Verity stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I want to understand why you are building this way. I want to understand what you know that everyone else does not." "Come back tomorrow," Astrid said after a long moment. "I will show you." Verity smiled. It was the first genuine smile Astrid had received from anyone in Pine Ridge besides Martha Briggs and Klaus Weber. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She asked questions constantly, intelligent questions that showed she was truly trying to understand. She took notes in a small leather journal, and sketching the diagonal bracing, recording the measurements, writing down the principles Astrid explained. She never told her father about these visits, 2 old people and 1 brave girl. Martha Briggs, Klaus Weber, and Verity Whitmore. An elderly widow, a quiet blacksmith, and a rancher's daughter standing with 2 orphan sisters against the mockery of everyone else. Sometimes the people who believe in you are few, sometimes they are not the ones you would expect, but sometimes few is enough. Have you ever had someone believe in you when no one else did? Share your story in the comments. The cabin was finished on the 21st of November, 1879. Astrid stood on the ridge and looked at what she had built. 24 feet from foundation to peak, 18 feet wide, 22 feet deep, walls 12 inches thick, hung with the gap between the layers packed tight with moss and dried grass, a fireplace of granite that rose through both floors and extended 8 feet above the roofline. And the door, the impossible door, 10 feet above the ground, accessed by a removable wooden staircase fitted with Klaus Weber's reinforced hinges and his ingenious locking mechanism that could not freeze shut. The first floor was complete with a hearth, a cooking area, storage for food and supplies, and sleeping pallets for the two sisters. But the second floor was where Astrid had focused most of her planning. 3 months of firewood stacked neatly against the walls, barrels of water, sacks of grain and flour, salted meat, dried beans, candles, blankets, everything 2 people would need to survive an extended siege, and space. Space for more than 2 people, a space for 20, if necessary. Because Astrid's grandfather had not built his 2-life house just for his own family. He had built it for his neighbors, the ones who had laughed at him, the ones who had called him a fool. He had saved them anyway. The first test came that same week. A cold snap descended on the valley, dropping temperatures to 15 degrees below zero and bringing winds of 40 miles per hour. It was not a true blizzard, just a taste of what was to come. A warning shot across the bow. In the town below, the people of Pine Ridge huddled in their cabins, feeding their fires constantly, piling blankets on blankets, watching their breath form clouds even indoors. Ezekiel Whitmore's ranch house, the finest in the valley, required 3 fires burning simultaneously to maintain a livable temperature. On the ridge, Astrid sat by her single fire, reading her father's journal, wearing nothing heavier than a wool sweater. The temperature inside the cabin was 58 degrees. Ingrid was baking bread. Ezekiel Whitmore rode past the cabin the day after the cold snap broke. He saw smoke rising steadily from the chimney. He saw Astrid outside, not bundled in every piece of clothing she owned, but working comfortably in a simple coat. He did not stop to speak.
She saved my father. She saved my mother. She saved me. And she did it even though we had...
He did not acknowledge what he saw, but something shifted behind his eyes, a crack in his certainty, a seed of doubt about everything he thought he knew. He rode on without a word, and Astrid watched him go. December arrived with an unsettling stillness. The birds left early that year. Flocks of geese that normally lingered until mid-December were gone by the first of the month, flying south in frantic formations as if fleeing from something terrible. The animals behaved strangely, squirrels hoarded with manic intensity. Bears retreated to their dens weeks ahead of schedule. Even the horses and cattle seemed nervous, stamping and whinnying for no apparent reason. Martha Briggs came to visit on December 15th, and for the first time, her face showed genuine fear. "My bones," she said, settling stiffly by the fire. "They are aching in a way I have not felt since '56. That was the year the big one came, the blizzard that buried 3 cabins on the north slope." She looked at Astrid with worried eyes. "Something bad is coming, child, something worse than usual." Astrid nodded. She had felt it too. A pressure in the air that seemed to push against her eardrums. A quality to the light that turned the sky a bruised shade of purple even at midday. She had seen that color in her grandfather's journal. He had drawn it in the margins with a note beneath. When the sky turns the color of a fresh bruise, you have 3 days, maybe less. Astrid began moving the last of their supplies to the second floor. Odin would not go outside. The dog who had spent 3 years waiting in the dust of Pine Ridge, who had never shown fear of anything, now refused to leave the cabin. He lay pressed against the fireplace, whining softly, his eyes tracking to the door every few seconds as if expecting something terrible to burst through. "Animals know," Ingrid said quietly. "They always know." "Yes," Astrid replied, "and they are telling us to prepare." She climbed to the second floor and looked out the high window and across the valley to the town below. She could see the cabins, see the smoke rising from their chimneys, see the people going about their daily business as if nothing was wrong. They did not know. They did not see the signs. They did not understand what was coming. "Should we warn them?" Ingrid asked, climbing up beside her. Astrid was silent for a long moment. "They will not listen," she said finally. "They will laugh. They will say we are trying to scare them. They will point at this cabin and call us fools one more time." But people could die. Astrid turned to look at her sister. People could die anyway, whether they believe us or not. All we can do is be ready. All we can do is keep this door open when the snow comes. She looked back out at the valley. The sky was darkening. The wind was beginning to rise. "When they come," she said, "and they will come, we will let them in. Every single one of them. Even the ones who laughed, even the ones who bet against us, even Ezekiel Whitmore himself." Ingrid nodded slowly. "Because that is what Grandfather would have done. Because that is what Grandfather did. The sky was darkening, the animals were hiding, every sign pointed to disaster. But the people of Pine Ridge went about their lives blind to the warnings all around them. If you saw a catastrophe coming and knew no one would believe you, what would you do? Would you try to warn them anyway? Or would you simply prepare yourself and wait? Let me know your thoughts." The storm arrived on December 23rd, 1879, at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It did not begin gently. There was no gradual transition from clear sky to light snow to heavy snow. One moment the sun was visible through a haze of clouds. The next moment the world disappeared. The snow did not fall. It attacked. It came sideways, driven by winds that screamed down from the mountain peaks with a sound like 1,000 locomotives. It came so thick and fast that visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. You could not see your hand in front of your face. You could not see your feet on the ground. And it was cold. Not the ordinary cold of winter, but something far more sinister. The kind of cold that seemed to reach through clothing and skin and muscle to wrap its fingers around your bones. The kind of cold that turned moisture in your nostrils to ice with every breath. The kind of cold that could kill an exposed man in minutes. In the town of Pine Ridge, people who had been outside scrambled for shelter. Doors slammed shut. Shutters were pulled closed. Fires were stoked to blazing, and the snow kept falling. By midnight on the first day, 3 feet of snow had accumulated on the ground. By midnight on the second day, Christmas Eve, there was 8 feet. The people of Pine Ridge began to realize they were in trouble. Ezekiel Whitmore's ranch house had a door that opened outward. By the morning of December 24, the snow had piled against that door so heavily that he could not push it open. He and his wife and his daughter Verity spent 3 hours digging from the inside, shoveling snow back into their own living room just to create enough space to force the door partially open. The cold rushed in like a living thing. In the time it took to shovel a narrow path to their woodpile, Whitmore's ears turned white with the first stages of frostbite. Well, Robert Mansfield, the carpenter who had declared the Solvang cabin structurally unsound, heard an ominous cracking sound from his roof on Christmas morning. The weight of the snow was beginning to stress the timbers. He spent the day in terror, waiting for the ceiling to collapse on his head. Cordelia Miller, a young widow with 3 small children, woke on Christmas Day to find that the snow had blocked her chimney. Smoke filled the cabin. She had to extinguish her fire or suffocate. By noon, the temperature inside her home had dropped to 20 degrees, and the snow kept falling. On the ridge above the valley, Astrid Solvang watched the world disappear. By the third day, the snow had reached the bottom of her first-floor windows, 8 feet deep, 10 feet, 12 feet. The weight of it pressed against the walls, but the walls held. But the diagonal bracing that Robert Mansfield had mocked distributed the pressure evenly, just as her grandfather had designed. By the fourth day, the snow covered the first-floor windows entirely. The main door was buried under 15 feet of white silence. Anyone watching from outside would have seen only the upper half of the cabin rising from a vast white plain, like a ship's mast protruding from a frozen ocean. But inside, life continued. Astrid and Ingrid had moved their entire operation to the second floor, exactly as planned. The fireplace roared, its heat trapped in the upper level by the insulated floor below. The chimney, extending 8 feet above the roofline, remained clear of snow, drawing smoke upward into the screaming wind. The temperature inside was 54 degrees. Ingrid was making soup. Odin lay by the fire, to calm now that they were safely enclosed, his head resting on his paws. The first sign of trouble from the valley came on the morning of the 5th day. Astrid was looking out the second-floor window, watching the endless white, when she saw something moving on the surface of the snow. A dark shape, struggling, falling, rising, struggling again. She watched it approach, slowly resolving into the figure of a person. A woman, judging by the size. Moving with desperate, exhausted determination toward the cabin on the ridge. Astrid did not hesitate. She pulled on her father's heavy coat, strapped on the wooden skis she had constructed according to his journal's specifications, and opened the second-floor door. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The cold hit her face like a physical blow, but she had been born for this moment, or had trained for it without knowing, had inherited generations of survival knowledge that now flowed through her veins like fire. She stepped out onto the snow. The skis were 10 feet long, broad enough to distribute her weight across the unstable surface. They were based on designs her grandfather had used in Norway, where the snow could reach depths that would swallow a man whole. With them, Astrid could glide across the top of the white ocean, moving with a speed and grace that would have been impossible on foot. She reached the struggling figure in minutes. It was Martha Briggs. The old woman had wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned, but it was not enough. Her lips were blue, her skin was grey. She was shaking so badly she could barely speak. "My cabin!" she managed to gasp. Roof collapsed, barely got out. Astrid did not waste time on words. She maneuvered the old woman onto her back, secured her with a rope around both their waists, and began the slow journey back to the cabin. Martha weighed almost nothing. Starvation and cold had stripped her of whatever padding her 72 years had accumulated, but even that slight weight made the journey difficult. The wind fought them every inch of the way. The snow shifted beneath the skis, threatening to swallow them both. They made it to the second-floor door just as the last of Astrid's strength gave out. Inside, Ingrid had hot soup waiting. She wrapped Martha in blankets, fed her slowly, rubbed warmth back into her frozen hands and feet. "How bad?" Astrid asked when she had caught her breath. Martha's eyes were haunted. "Bad." She shook her head slowly. "The Miller cabin, and I could see it from my place before the roof fell in." The chimney was cold, no smoke. She looked at Astrid with desperate hope. "Cordelia has 3 little ones. The youngest is only 5. Astrid did not need to hear more. "Stay here," she said to Ingrid. "Keep the fire burning. I will be back." She strapped on the skis and went back out into the white death. Finding the Miller cabin was not easy. The landmarks Astrid had memorized were gone, buried under 20 feet of snow. The trees she had used for navigation were visible only as dark tips poking up from the white surface. Even the shape of the land had changed, valleys filled in and rises flattened by the massive accumulation. But she had studied her grandfather's journal. She had learned to read the snow, to understand how wind created patterns, to follow the subtle clues that nature left for those who knew how to look. She found the Miller cabin by its chimney. It was the only part of the structure still visible above the snow. A cold, dead chimney with no smoke rising from its mouth. A silent marker for a buried tomb. Astrid pulled the wooden spade from her back and began to dig. 10 feet down, she hit the roof. 5 more feet of horizontal digging brought her to the chimney base. She cleared the blockage of snow and ice that had sealed it shut, then pressed her face to the opening and shouted, "Hello, is anyone alive down there?" Silence. She shouted again. Still nothing. Then, faint as a whisper, she heard it, a sound so soft it might have been imagined, a child crying somewhere in the darkness below. Astrid had never dug faster in her life. The Miller family was barely alive. Cordelia had made a nest of blankets in the corner, farthest from the door, piling her 3 children together for warmth. They had been without fire for 2 days. The temperature in the cabin had dropped to 12 degrees. Another few hours and they would have been dead. Emma, the youngest at 5 years old, was the worst off. Her lips were purple. Her small body had stopped shivering, which Astrid knew was a very bad sign. The body shivered to generate heat. When it stopped shivering, it meant the body had given up. Astrid worked quickly. She could not bring all 4 of them at once. She would have to make multiple trips. She took Emma first, the most critical, bundled the child against her chest, strapped her in place, and made the agonizing journey back to her cabin. I then returned for the next child, then the next, then finally Cordelia herself, who protested weakly that she could make it on her own, but collapsed into Astrid's arms within seconds. 4 trips, 4 journeys across the frozen nightmare, 4 times fighting the wind and the cold and the exhaustion that threatened to drag her down into the snow forever. When she finally brought Cordelia through the 2nd floor door, Astrid collapsed on the floor and did not move for an hour. But she could not rest for long, because even as she lay there, gasping for breath, her muscles screaming, her frozen skin burning as it slowly warmed, she could hear something. Faint sounds carried on the wind, voices calling for help, the distant crack of a roof giving way, the screams of cattle dying in the snow. The entire valley was being buried alive. And she was the only one who could move across the surface of the White Death. 48 hours, 11 rescue missions, 23 people pulled from the jaws of death. That is what Astrid Solvang accomplished over the next 2 days. Her hands bled, her muscles tore, her lungs burned from breathing air so cold it turned to ice in her chest. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because every hour she rested was an hour that someone else might die. Would you have had the strength to keep going? Would you have had the courage? Share your thoughts below. By the 6th day, there were 19 people crowded into the cabin designed for 4. Martha Briggs, the first refugee, had taken charge of the cooking. Cordelia Miller and her 3 children huddled near the fire, the youngest finally beginning to show colour in her cheeks. To Robert Mansfield, the carpenter who had declared the structure unsound, sat in a corner with his head in his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Father Brennan led prayers twice a day, his voice cracking with emotion and something that sounded very much like shame. Ingrid managed the supplies, carefully rationing the food and water to make sure everyone had enough. She had grown up in the past week, her 14-year-old face hardening into something older and more determined. and Odin moved between the refugees, allowing frightened children to bury their faces in his fur, providing comfort simply by being present. Little Emma Miller, the 5-year-old who had nearly died, would not let go of him. She slept curled against his warm body, her small fingers tangled in his fur. But there were still people missing. Ezekiel Whitmore and his family had not been seen. Klaus Weber was unaccounted for. Colt Tanner and his friends, the young men who had bet on the cabin's failure, had not appeared. Astrid knew their approximate locations. She knew which direction to search, but she was running out of strength. She was running out of time. And she was not sure she wanted to save Ezekiel Whitmore. It was Ingrid who forced the issue. She found Astrid sitting alone on the second floor, staring out the window at the endless white. "You are thinking about not going," Ingrid said quietly. "You are thinking about leaving Whitmore to die." Astrid did not answer. "He said you were building your own grave. He laughed at us. He made everyone else laugh at us. I know he bet money that we would fail. He hoped we would fail." "I know." Ingrid sat down beside her sister. Then why are you hesitating?" Astrid finally turned to look at her. "Because I am tired," she said. Her voice cracked. "Because I have given everything I have to save people who spent months mocking us. Because I am afraid that if I go out there one more time, I will not come back. And because part of me," she paused, swallowing hard, "part of me thinks he deserves to freeze." Ingrid was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandfather saved the people who laughed at him." Astrid closed her eyes. He did not ask if they deserved it. He did not ask if they were sorry. He saved them because he could, because no one else could. Because that is what a Solvang does. A long silence stretched between them. Astrid opened her eyes. She looked at her sister. She looked at the door. Then she reached for her skis. The Whitmore ranch house had partially collapsed. Astrid found it by following the line of fence posts that barely protruded above the snow. The roof had caved in on the eastern side, creating a jagged wound in the structure. Snow had poured through the gap, filling half the interior, but there was smoke rising from the remaining chimney. Someone was alive. She dug down to the only window that was still visible, a small frame on the western wall, and broke through the ice-covered glass. "Hello, is anyone alive in there?" A voice came back, weak but recognizable. "We are here." The voice was Ezekiel Whitmore's. "Dear God, we are here." They were in the corner of the kitchen, the only part of the house still intact. Whitmore had built a makeshift shelter from overturned furniture, creating a small space that retained some heat from the struggling fire. His wife was unconscious, her breathing shallow. His daughter Verity was awake, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Something that looked like recognition, like understanding. "She found us," Verity whispered. "Father, she found us." Whitmore stared at Astrid as if seeing a ghost. "You," he said. His voice was hoarse. "You came for us." "Yes. After everything I said, after everything I did," his face crumpled. "I called you a fool. I told everyone you were building a grave. I laughed at you." Astrid looked at him steadily. "I know. Then why? Why would you save us?" Astrid was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because my grandfather saved the people who laughed at him. Because that is what his cabin was built for, not just to survive, to save." She held out her hand. "Stop talking and help me get your family out of here." The journey back to the cabin was the hardest of all. Whitmore's wife could not walk. She had to be carried on an improvised stretcher, pulled across the snow like cargo. Verity could move on her own, but barely. her strength sapped by days of cold and fear. Whitmore himself was weakened by days of cold and hunger, but Verity understood something the others did not. She had watched Astrid build this cabin, she had taken notes, she had learned the principles, and now she saw them in action. "The second floor door," she murmured as they approached, her voice filled with wonder. "It works, it actually works. Of course it works," Astrid said. "The old ways always work." The wind had picked up again, driving ice crystals into their faces like needles, and the temperature had dropped to 47 degrees below zero. Even with her grandfather's design principles protecting her, Astrid felt the cold seeping into her bones. They made it to the cabin just as her legs gave out completely. 23 people in a space designed for 4. But they were alive. All of them. Every single one. The fire burned steadily, its heat captured by the insulated walls and ceiling. The air was close and warm and smelled of too many bodies in too small a space. Children cried. Adults murmured to each other in low voices. Someone was always praying. And in the corner, Ezekiel Whitmore sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, tears streaming down his weathered face. The 7th day dawned clear and cold. The storm had passed. The wind had died. The sun emerged from behind the clouds and cast its light across a landscape that had been utterly transformed. There was no valley anymore. There was only snow. A vast white plain that stretched from horizon to horizon, broken only by the tips of the tallest trees and the peaks of the surrounding mountains. The cabins of Pine Ridge were gone, buried beneath 25 feet of frozen silence. Only one structure was visible above the surface. One strange, impossible building, with a door 10 feet off the ground. One lighthouse for a sea that had finally arrived. The double cabin stood like a monument in the white emptiness, and inside 23 people were alive. They emerged slowly, climbing down a ladder that Astrid had improvised from spare lumber. Or they stood on the surface of the snow and looked out at a world they did not recognize. Ezekiel Whitmore was the last to descend. He walked slowly to where Astrid stood, still wearing her father's coat, still holding the skis that had carried her across the frozen nightmare. He stopped in front of her and looked into her eyes. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "We were all wrong." He fell to his knees in the snow. "I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could save us. I laughed at you while you were preparing for exactly this moment. I bet money on your failure while you were stockpiling supplies that would keep us alive." Tears froze on his cheeks as soon as they fell. "I have been in these mountains for 30 years. I thought I knew everything. I did not know anything at all." Astrid looked down at him. The man who had mocked her, the man who had hoped she would fail, the man she had saved anyway. She reached down and took his hand. "Get up, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "We have a lot of work to do." Robert Mansfield approached her next. "The 2nd floor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I said it would not hold 20 people. I said the diagonal bracing was unnecessary. I said your grandfather's techniques were primitive." He shook his head slowly. "Last night, there were 23 of us on that floor. 23 people, plus supplies, plus firewood, and the floor did not even creak." He looked at her with eyes full of wonder and shame in equal measure. "I have been building for 25 years, but I have never built anything like this." He paused. "Will you teach me?" Astrid nodded. "Yes, I will teach anyone who wants to learn. Father Brennan was the hardest." He approached her later that day, when most of the others had begun the grim work of assessing the damage below. "I question the source of your knowledge," he said. He could not meet her eyes. I called it pagan wisdom. I suggested that God would not approve. He was silent for a long moment. But God works through many instruments, he continued finally, through the wisdom of the ancients, through the knowledge passed from generation to generation, through the hands of a 19-year-old girl who saved my life when I did not deserve to be saved. He finally looked at her. I am sorry for doubting you, for doubting your grandfather, for doubting the God who clearly sent you to us. Astrid accepted his apology as she had accepted all the others, with grace, with forgiveness, with the quiet strength of a woman who had never needed their approval in the first place. When the snow finally began to melt in March of 1880, the people of Pine Ridge discovered the full extent of the damage. 67 head of cattle had died. 4 cabins had collapsed completely. Dozens of others had sustained serious damage. The economic loss was staggering. But here is what mattered most. Not a single human being had died within 5 miles of Astrid Solvang's cabin. Not one. In a storm that would later be recorded as one of the worst in California history, the double cabin had saved every single person who reached its door. That is the power of preparation. That is the power of knowledge passed down through generations. That is the power of refusing to give up, even when the whole world is laughing at you. But spring came slowly to the Sierra Nevada in 1880. The snow began to melt in February, revealing the wreckage beneath. Collapsed roofs, frozen cattle carcasses, shattered fences. The valley looked like a battlefield after the war had moved on. But the people of Pine Ridge were alive, and they were different. Ezekiel Whitmore was the first to begin rebuilding. But he did not rebuild the same way he had built before. He came to Astrid with his plans, spreading them out on her table, asking questions that he would never have asked 6 months earlier. "Show me the diagonal bracing," he said. "Show me how the second-floor door works. Show me why your chimney stayed clear when everyone else's got blocked." Astrid showed him. She showed him everything. She held nothing back. Within a month, Whitmore's new cabin was taking shape, and it was different from his old one. Higher walls, steeper roof, and yes, a second-floor door that looked out over the valley like an eye watching for danger. By summer, 7 families had begun rebuilding using Astrid's design principles. Robert Mansfield, the carpenter who had once declared her techniques structurally unsound, became her most enthusiastic student. He took notes on everything. He asked questions constantly. He practiced the diagonal bracing until he could do it in his sleep. "This will change how we build in these mountains," he said one day, standing back to admire a completed framework. "In 10 years, every cabin in the Sierra Nevada will have a second-floor door." "Maybe," Astrid said, "or maybe people will forget. Maybe they will decide the old ways are good enough. Or maybe they will only remember when the next big storm comes." Mansfield shook his head. "Not me. I will never forget, and I will make sure my children never forget either." Klaus Weber emerged from the storm 3 days after it ended. He had survived by doing what his uncle had done in Bavaria 50 years earlier. He had sealed himself in his forge, kept his fire burning, and waited for the white death to pass. When he finally dug himself out, the first thing he did was climb the ridge to Astrid's cabin. "The hinges held?" he asked. Astrid smiled. They held. 23 people passed through that door. Not one of them got stuck. Klaus nodded, satisfied. "Good." He looked out at the valley below, at the wreckage being slowly revealed as the snow melted. "My uncle would have been proud." "Tell me about him," Astrid said. So Klaus told her. And about the avalanche of 1854, about the 23 people who survived by reaching his uncle's door, about the old ways of building that had kept his family alive for generations. It was the longest conversation Klaus Weber had ever had with anyone in Pine Ridge. Colt Tanner came to apologize in June. The young man who had organized the betting pool against Astrid stood at her door with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground. "I bet $10 that your cabin would fall down," he said. His voice was thick with shame. "I bet another 10 that you would run back to Sacramento. I laughed at you every day. I told everyone you were crazy." Astrid waited. "You saved my mother," Tanner continued. "She was at the Henderson place when the roof collapsed. She would have died if you had not found her." He finally looked up. I was wrong about everything, and I want to make it right." "How?" Astrid asked. "Teach me," Tanner said. "Teach me what you know, not just the building, the skiing, the surviving, all of it." He straightened his shoulders. "I want to be able to do what you did. I want to be able to save people like you saved my mother." Astrid studied him for a long moment. She saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. Humility, determination, the willingness to learn. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Bring your own axe." Even the people who bet against her came to learn from her, even the young men who had laughed and wagered and hoped she would fail. That is what true vindication looks like. Not revenge, not bitterness, not gloating over those who doubted you. True vindication is when your former enemies become your students, or when the people who laughed at you come asking for your wisdom, when you win not by proving them wrong, but by helping them become right. Has someone who doubted you ever come back to ask for your help? How did you respond? The winter of 1880 to 1881 was mild. The winter of 1881 to 1882 was not. Another massive storm struck the Sierra Nevada in January of 1882, burying the valley under 18 feet of snow. But this time, the outcome was different. 12 cabins in Pine Ridge now had second-floor doors. The people inside those cabins survived without needing rescue. They simply moved to their upper levels, as the Solvangs had taught them, and waited for the storm to pass. Those who had not yet rebuilt came to the cabins that had. They knew the doors would open for them. They knew because Astrid had made it clear that every cabin built with her design principles was expected to serve the same purpose her cabin served: a shelter for the community, a refuge for the desperate, a second life when the White Death came. Not a single person died in the storm of 1882. The fame of the Solvang sisters spread beyond Pine Ridge. Newspapers in Sacramento picked up the story. The tale of the Orphan girls who had built an impossible cabin and saved an entire town captured the imagination of readers across California. Reporters came to interview them. Artists came to sketch the double cabin. Scientists came to study the building techniques. In 1883, a professor from the University of California visited Pine Ridge to document Astrid's methods. He measured the walls, he calculated the insulation values. Keeney tested the structural integrity of the diagonal bracing. "Remarkable," he declared, when his analysis was complete. "The thermal efficiency is superior to anything currently taught in American architecture schools. The structural design anticipates loads that most engineers do not even consider. These techniques should be studied and implemented throughout the mountain regions of the western states." His report was published in a scientific journal. It was read by builders and architects across the country. Some of them came to see the cabin for themselves. Some of them went home and started building differently. The old ways were becoming new again. But Astrid's greatest legacy was not the cabin itself. In the spring of 1883, she received an unusual offer. The United States Postal Service was looking for someone to carry mail across the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter months. It was a job that had defeated every previous candidate. The snow was too deep. The cold was too severe. The distances were too great. They had heard about the orphan girl who could ski across 20 feet of snow. They had heard about the rescue missions she had performed during the Great Blizzard. They had heard that she could go places where horses could not follow. They wanted to know if she would carry the mail. Astrid accepted. For the next 15 years, Astrid Solvang was the only reliable mail carrier across the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter. She became known as Snowshoe Astrid, though her equipment was actually the 10-foot skis of her grandfather's design rather than traditional snowshoes. She carried 90-pound mail bags across passes that were buried under 20 feet of snow. She traveled in blizzards that stopped steam engines in their tracks. She went places where no one else could go. The government did not pay her for the first 8 years. The bureaucracy moved slowly, and there was no official position for a female mail carrier in the mountains of California. But Astrid carried the mail anyway, because she could, because no one else could, because that was what a Solvang did. When payment finally came, she used the money to build a school in Pine Ridge. Ingrid took a different path. She married Heinrich Weber, the son of Klaus the blacksmith, in 1885. They built a cabin together using the techniques that Astrid had taught them. It had 12-inch walls and diagonal bracing, and a second-floor door that looked out over the valley. Their first child, a boy they named Eric, after the grandfather he would never meet, was born the following spring. Odin, growing old and grey now, appointed himself the child's guardian, sleeping beside the cradle every night, just as he had once guarded Astrid and Ingrid through the long winters. Ingrid became the first teacher in the Pine Ridge school that Astrid's mail money had built. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but she also taught other things. She taught children how to read the sky for signs of coming storms. She taught them how to build walls that could hold back the cold. She taught them the old ways that her grandfather had passed down through generations. The knowledge did not die with one family. It spread through an entire community and then beyond. Odin died in the autumn of 1888. He was 14 years old, ancient for a dog of his size. He had spent his final years lying by the fire in the cabin he had helped build, his greying muzzle resting on his paws, surrounded by young Eric, now 2 years old, who would often curl up beside the old dog while listening to his Aunt Astrid tell stories about the blizzard of '79, stories about how Odin had pulled supplies through the snow, had kept frightened children warm with his fur, had somehow known the storm was coming before anyone else. Odin died peacefully in his sleep one October morning, his head resting on his paws, just as he had rested through so many long winter nights. They buried him under the tallest pine tree on the Solvang property, the tree that had served as a landmark for Astrid during her rescue missions. They carved a simple marker from local granite. Odin, faithful guardian. Through every storm, 1874 to 1888, Astrid stood at his grave for a long time, remembering the day she had arrived in Pine Ridge. The dust of the road, the stagecoach rattling away. The dog who had been waiting for 3 years, who had somehow known that she was coming. He was waiting for us, Ingrid said quietly, standing beside her, little Eric in her arms. Yes, Astrid replied. He knew we were coming before we knew ourselves. The cabin still stood in 1978, nearly 100 years after Astrid and Ingrid Solvang had built it with their own hands. Researchers from the University of California at Berkeley came to study the structure. They brought modern instruments. They took precise measurements. So they analyzed the building techniques with tools that had not existed when the cabin was built. Their findings were published in an academic journal the following year. The thermal efficiency of the Solvang cabin, they wrote, exceeds that of most structures built in the region today. The insulation value of the double wall construction, while utilizing only materials available in the 1870s, achieves results comparable to modern standards. The structural integrity of the diagonal bracing system distributes loads in a manner that anticipates engineering principles not formally codified until the 20th century. The cabin was added to the California Register of Historical Resources in 1980. A plaque was installed at the site telling the story of two orphan girls who built an impossible house and saved an entire town. Visitors still come to see it today. Astrid Solvang died in 1932 in the cabin she had built 53 years earlier. She was 72 years old. She had never married. She had spent her life carrying mail and teaching building techniques and helping her community prepare for winters that grew no gentler as the years passed. In her final months, she sat by the fire and told stories to Ingrid's grandchildren. Stories about their great-great-grandfather Magnus, who had survived the White Death of 1849 in Norway. Stories about their great-grandfather Eric, who had come to America with nothing but a leather journal and a dream. Stories about two orphan girls who had arrived in Pine Ridge with no money, no experience, and no one to help them. The children listened with wide eyes. They did not fully understand, not yet. But someday they would. Someday they would face their own storms, their own doubters, their own moments when the whole world seemed to be laughing at them. And when that day came, they would remember. They buried Astrid next to Odin under the tall pine tree that had grown even taller in the decades since the dog's death. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, including the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those she had saved during the Great Blizzard of 1879. Verity Whitmore gave the eulogy. She was 69 years old now, her hair white as the snow that had once nearly killed her, but her eyes were still sharp with the intelligence that had made her Astrid's first true student from the town. She had kept the leather journal from those autumn days of 1879, filled with her careful notes about diagonal bracing and thermal mass and the principles of survival. She had taught those principles to her own children, and they had taught them to theirs. "I was 16 when I first watched her work," Verity said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Everyone in town said she was crazy. My own father called her cabin a grave. But I saw something different. I saw someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who had knowledge that the rest of us were too proud to recognize." She paused, looking out at the crowd gathered beneath the pine tree. "She saved my father, she saved my mother, she saved me. And she did it even though we had laughed at her, even though my father had bet money on her failure. She saved us because she could, because no one else could, because that was who she was." Verity's voice grew stronger. "My father spent the rest of his life telling people about the crazy orphan girl who built a lighthouse on the mountain. But he never called her crazy after that night in December of 1879. He called her the wisest person he had ever met." She looked down at the simple grave, at the granite marker that would soon be placed there. And he was right. The marker on Astrid's grave was simple, carved from the same granite as Odin's memorial. It bore only her name, the dates of her birth and death, and 3 words that she had spoken to Ezekiel Whitmore on that cold October day in 1879. 3 words that had become her legacy. 3 words that summed up everything she believed about patience and preparation and the power of knowing something that others refused to see. To Astrid Solvang, 1860 to 1932, you will see the double cabin still stands today, maintained by the California Historical Society and visited by thousands of people every year. They come to see the impossible door 10 feet above the ground, with its reinforced hinges that Klaus Weber forged nearly 150 years ago. They come to see the walls, 12 inches thick, still solid after more than a century of Sierra Nevada winters. They come to see the fireplace, rising through both floors, its granite blackened by generations of fires that kept the cold at bay. But mostly, they come to remember two orphan girls who refused to listen when the whole world told them they were wrong. Who built something impossible because they knew it would be necessary. Who saved the lives of people who had laughed at them, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to teach their methods to others. Sometimes the crowd is not always right. Sometimes the person everyone is laughing at is the only one who knows which way the wind is blowing. Sometimes the old ways survive for a reason, and sometimes two sisters with nothing but a worn leather journal and a faithful dog can save an entire community simply by refusing to give up. This is the story of Astrid and Ingrid Solvang, the orphan girls who built the impossible cabin, the sisters who saved Pine Ridge, the women who proved that knowledge passed down through generations is sometimes worth more than all the experience and expertise in the world. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is being laughed at for doing something different. It's someone who is being told their ideas are crazy, someone who needs to know that being mocked today does not mean being wrong forever. And if you have ever been that person, if you have ever faced the laughter and the doubt and the certainty that you would fail, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments below. Tell me about the time you built your own impossible cabin. Tell me about the storm you survived, because you are not alone. You never were. And somewhere out there, someone is waiting to learn from what you know. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for being part of this community that believes in the power of stories to change lives. Until next time, the end